It was nearly midnight when Kevin finally arrived at the isolated cabin deep in Blackridge Forest. He had inherited it from an uncle he'd never met, along with a letter that simply read, "Never stay after dark." Of course, he laughed it off. Nothing but eccentric ramblings from an elderly relative. Now, standing alone in the cabin's doorway, surrounded by endless trees, he felt less certain. Darkness pressed in on all sides, heavy and cold, even though it was summer. Inside, the cabin was dusty and smelled faintly of mildew. Kevin placed his bags down, lighting a lantern on the old wooden table. Shadows danced on the walls, creating distorted shapes. The silence was oppressive, interrupted only by the distant hoot of an owl. Kevin settled into an armchair near the fireplace, leafing through faded photos he'd found stacked on a shelf. Faces stared back. Grim, unsmiling figures posed stiffly, as though afraid of the camera. A sense of unease grew within him. Suddenly, the lantern flickered violently, plunging the room briefly into darkness. Kevin glanced around, heart quickening. A soft, indistinct whisper drifted through the cabin, coming from nowhere yet everywhere at once. He stood abruptly. "Hello? Who's there?" No answer, only the growing whispers, too faint to understand, but undeniably real. Kevin grabbed the lantern, stepping outside cautiously. The forest was completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. Every tree stood perfectly still, as if holding its breath. Then the whispers returned, louder, echoing between the trees. "Join us!" The voices murmured in unison, like dozens of people speaking softly at once. Kevin spun around, sweat beading on his forehead. Shapes began emerging from the shadows, dark silhouettes standing perfectly still among the trees. Their forms flickered, edges blurring into the darkness. Panicking, he rushed back into the cabin, locking the heavy wooden door behind him. He paced anxiously, heart hammering, but the whispers continued to seep through cracks in the walls, growing louder, closer. "Kevin!" A voice whispered clearly, chilling him to the bone. He turned sharply. In the window stood the figure of a woman, her face pale, eyes hollow and sunken. Her mouth moved rapidly, murmuring those relentless whispers. He stumbled backward, knocking over the lantern, plunging himself once again into darkness. The cabin creaked loudly, as though shifting its weight. Around him, silhouettes materialized, crowding the small room, blocking the exit. Their shadowy forms stretched upward, featureless yet unmistakably human. "What do you want from me?" Kevin shouted desperately. In response, one figure stepped forward, features slowly becoming visible. Kevin froze. It was his uncle, the one he'd never met, yet instantly recognized from the photographs. His expression was blank, eyes hollow. "You shouldn't have stayed after dark," the figure murmured, gently, almost regretfully. Kevin backed against the wall as the shadows pressed closer. Cold, insubstantial hands reached out, brushing against his skin. A chill seeped through him, draining his strength, his will to resist. Suddenly, everything stopped. The shadows paused, frozen, expectant. His uncle whispered again, leaning in close. "Now you must remain, like us." The lantern flared back to life, illuminating the empty cabin. Kevin was alone once more, panting, his heart racing wildly. Had it been a hallucination? He reached for his bag, determined to leave immediately. But as he opened the cabin door, he froze in horror. Outside stood countless shadowy figures, silent and still, forming an endless circle around the cabin, waiting. The lantern flickered again as the whispers returned, softly at first, then growing into a deafening chant. "Join us!" The forest closed around Kevin, shadows consuming everything. By morning, the cabin stood empty, silent once more, waiting patiently for the next visitor foolish enough to remain after dark.